Hello, gentlemen. In my last video, I had talked about I started the discussion on the historical development of taxation law in Nigeria. The last thing I mentioned, if you would recall, is that the first the first piece of legislation that unified, that placed all the different taxation statutes operating at different regions of pre-colonial Nigeria. The first legislation that brought all of them together under one single legislation on taxation in Nigeria was the Direct Tax Ordinance of 1940. So I had made mention of that, and I've highlighted that one prominent feature of this Direct Tax Ordinance of 1940 is that it introduced, amongst other things of course, it introduced taxation, group-based taxation, that is taxation on communities, families. So in other words, moving the whole concept of taxation from an individual basis to group basis. So taxes were imposed on a community as a group, taxes were imposed on a family as a group, and so on and so forth. Okay, so today we will be rounding up that discussion by going ahead to say that, after the Direct Tax Ordinance of 1940, thereafter subsequent legislations were passed, for the whole territory of Nigeria, one of which is the Income Tax Ordinance number 29 of 1943. And of course, you will know that from 1956, you started having regional governments in Nigeria in preparation for independence. So to that extent, each of these regions, having their own legislature, also began to make laws for taxation as it affects the regions of Nigeria, moving away from just federal taxes, because you had the federal and regional governments around this 1956 era. So pursuant to that, you had the Eastern Region Finance Law number 1 of 1956. You had the Western Region Income Tax Law also of 1956, and then you had the Northern Nigerian Personal Tax Law also of 1956. And then of course at federal level, you've had further developments of federal tax laws. You had the Income Tax Management Act of 1961, which was the first unified federal taxation law after independence. Right? The Income Tax Management Act 1961, and then you also have the Income Tax Management Uniform Taxation Provisions Act of 1975, and all the way down to the present tax legislations that you have in the country. So today you have the Personal Income Tax Act, you have the Company Income Tax Act, you have the Capital Gains Tax Act, you have the Value Added Tax Act, you have the Stamp Duties Act, and so on and so forth. Okay, as a matter of fact, there is a compendium put together by the Federal Inland Revenue Service, FRS. I recommend you get that compendium. In that compendium, you will find over 100 pieces of legislation on taxation law in Nigeria. Okay, and then finally, in discussing the history of taxation law in Nigeria, is to look at the fiscal structure